I'm Max Price, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, and I have just the very short duty and pleasure to welcome you all here. The function is hosted by the Senate Academic Freedom Committee, and so all of the introductions and chairing the session will be by Jacques, who is the chair of the Academic Freedom Committee. And just to say, it's a special pleasure to have so many students present today. The Academic Freedom Lecture, the TB Davie Lecture, is an annual lecture started many years ago to protest against restrictions on academic freedom, as you will hear when the chair introduces it. But in recent years, I have a feeling that students in particular have not had that sense of urgency that academic freedom was under threat, and had probably not known another period when it was under threat, and therefore maybe didn't feel as acutely the need to defend academic freedom. My sense is that over the last year or two, particularly with the campaigns around the Protection of Information Bill and the students' involvement in that, the campaigns around various forms of censorship and the issues around cartoons, around criticism of government and public officials, that there is a much greater appreciation of how important not just freedom of speech in general is, but academic freedom in particular, and how the universities need to play a critical role in defending those freedoms. So this lecture, the TB Davie Lecture, I believe is as important today as it ever was, and it's great that we have this kind of attendance. Over to you, Jacques.
Thank you, Dr. Price. Thomas Benjamin Davie led the university as Vice-Chancellor from 1948 until his death in 1955. He is remembered as a fearless defender of the principles of academic freedom. He championed this cause and the autonomy of the university in general, defining academic freedom as the university's right to determine who shall be taught, who shall teach, what shall be taught, and how it shall be taught, without regard to any criterion except academic merit. This legacy is honoured through the TB Davie Memorial Lecture series, beginning in 1959 with a lecture by former Chief Justice and UCT Chancellor Albert van der Sant St-Levers, after whom a building adjacent to this one is named. In subsequent years, the lecture has been delivered by, amongst others, Z.K. Matthews, Walter Sisulu, Wole Siyenka, Kader Asmal, and Frederick van Zyl-Slabbert. When the Academic Freedom Committee invited Ferial Haffajee to deliver the 47th annual TB Davie Lecture, it was in the knowledge that we were inviting one of South Africa's media luminaries. Her career started with an internship at what was then the Weekly Mail in 1991, a publication at which she gained immediate exposure to the challenges of working in a medium where a desire to reveal and discuss matters in the public interest would frequently be met by powerful dissenting voices, requesting and sometimes requiring that you refrain from speaking. After leaving the Weekly Mail, Ferial worked in radio as a producer and reporter at the SABC, before joining the Financial Mail as political editor and later managing editor. In 2004, she rejoined what had by then become the Mail and Guardian, where she served as editor for 5 years. In 2009, she was appointed editor-in-chief at the City Press. Throughout these 20-odd years, Ferial has been no stranger to controversy and having to fend off attempts at censorship. In 2005, the High Court barred the Mail and Guardian from publishing a story on the Oilgate scandal, detailing how the Mvume Oil Company had paid millions of taxpayer rands to the ANC. Just as the publication had done in the 1980s, Ferial insisted on running the story, but with the banned segments blacked out. In 2006, she published what had become known as the Danish cartoons, one of them, to illustrate a story about the protests generated by the infamous depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. Threats to both herself and her family resulted from this choice. The committee knew all of this when inviting her to address us today. What we did not and could not have been aware of is just how appropriate a choice of speaker Ferial would end up being. I refer, of course, to the events of May this year, when Brett Murray's painting The Spear was hung and then defaced at the Goodman Gallery and published, then later retracted by the City Press. The Spear highlighted various fractures and various absurdities in South African society. One absurdity, for me at least, was in hearing a sitting Minister of Education call for the destruction of an artwork. Another was the inconsistency between the near-complete silence from social media pundits as well as government spokespersons when members of the political opposition are racially slurred or crudely insulted, and the contrast between this and the outrage generated by the lack of respect shown by this painting and the publication of it. A morality that appears to be selective is difficult to fathom and sometimes difficult to respect. For some, it was, of course, always absurd that an act of satire could be this divisive, this inflammatory. For others, the lack of sympathy or understanding for this outrage was the real absurdity and a real travesty of decency. In South Africa, these fractures are sometimes quite shallow beneath the surface. A key question, of course, is how to deal with them. Another key question is how one gets and perhaps stays in a position to do anything about them, and at what cost. Academic freedom and media freedom are natural bedfellows, perhaps most obviously because of the symbiosis of a media revealing things that might benefit from academic study, and through academic activity frequently being newsworthy. But more crucial, perhaps, is media freedom simply as a barometer of a country's freedom more generally. In a 2009 interview, Ferial said, "Until just over a year ago, I was singing that we enjoyed world-class media freedom, especially compared to some other African countries such as the DRC, where 4 radio journalists were murdered last year, or Ethiopia, where all independent journalists are in jail or in exile. But the ratcheting up of rhetoric against journalists since Polokwane is very, very dangerous. There's a fundamental philosophical difference between how the ANC perceives media freedom and how we journalists perceive it." Explaining her decision to withdraw the spear from the City Press website earlier this year, she remarked, "I hope that we are not crafting a society where we consign journalism to a free expression constrained by the limits of fear. This week's society began the path of setting its mores on how we treat precedents in art and journalism, what is acceptable and what is not. Expression is perhaps at most partly free when one is afraid to speak. Arguably, it's not at all free. Demands for silence on the grounds of culture, tradition, or offences to dignity can sometimes be self-serving in that they forestall much possible debate or reflection on the merits of an artwork or a speech act. Not the merits in terms of quality and originality, which are separate matters, but the merits in terms of the discomfort and self-reflection the artwork could inspire. The easiest way to justify poor arguments or mistaken ideas is simply to refuse to discuss them. And if it is a mistaken idea that presidents, for example, merit special protection from these sorts of insults, playing the race card or the culture card serves to rule that discussion out of order, leaving us unable to discuss these ideas at all. It's easy to agree that a painting like the spear is disrespectful. I'd imagine that's part of its point. You might think the painting in unacceptably bad taste, but your aesthetic preferences and cultural norms are of no more consequence than anyone else's, at least in theory. Many of you might share my hope that we can one day learn to deal with insults like these without feeling the need for the protection of the courts, or from a film and publication board, which exhibits a very dubious morality itself in listing a known homophobic organization as a useful link on its website. I have this hope because it remains true that any restrictions on free speech on the basis of offence or slights to dignity threaten to put us on an unprincipled and very slippery slope. These sorts of things are perhaps easier for some of us to believe and for some of us to say than for others. But it's then again also true that some of us have easier access to the courts than others. Absolute freedom, including the freedom to offend, is usually not the only value at issue in contestations such as these. It is sometimes the case that one might be free to speak but choose not to speak, or simply to regret having done so. Because the harms seem to sometimes far outweigh any possible benefits, this makes absolute principles difficult to defend. As someone who has experienced these dilemmas at first hand, we look forward to hearing Ferial Haffajee's thoughts on creeping censorship and the spearing of freedom.
Thank you, Dr. Max. Thank you very much, Jacques. Really nice introduction. And isn't it a most wonderful day, friends, to be South African today? I can just imagine the children who are going to be named Cameron and Chad at the Groote Schuur Hospital down the road. And I also hope by the end of the Olympics that there are many little Custers and Oscars and that guy who rides his BMX so wonderfully. I think it's a fine, fine day. So I'm going to start. It may look to you like I've lost my way. I'm very honored to be here to honor a man, to do a lecture in his name of somebody who practiced his freedom and fought for it when it was a much, much tougher thing to do. So it's going to feel to you for moments like I've lost my way here. Like I'm talking about stuff that you didn't come to hear. But trust me, I'll get there eventually. My key point is like Amartya Sen's, that development is freedom, and that's the entire theme of my discussion. So there'll also be music in bits, and I hope that you can help me identify this first song. Thanks for finding the sound button. So that's Slicker, and his song has caused a stir. It's called Blacks Are Fools, and let me tell you, in some circles that some of you know, it's caused a stir that's almost bigger than the spear. And his premise is this, is that 18 years after freedom's come, what the hell? Why is life still so bloody difficult for the black majority? Is it apartheid? Is it colonialism? Or is it incompetence and corruption of this, our government? It's probably all three. The message is very clear to me in that song. Development is freedom. Without development, there is no freedom. So by 2014, when we celebrate 20 years of democracy, where will we be? Here's another view to Slickers, and it's brought to us by the analyst J.P. Landman, who I heard speaking last week. He's a guy who enjoys shooting down conventional thinking. And JP's core thesis is this. The country is wealthier and has achieved better rates of growth than the apartheid state managed in the final 2 decades of its rule. In his words, these are not mine, so it turns out the darkies are way better at governing than the whiteys. It has used this money well. There are now about 16 million people on grants of some kind. For me, a meaningful form of Ubuntu. It's kept our country stable and has given poor people a strong sense of dignity, and it is, for me, a form of democracy. Our money managers have done this so well that they've kept these social welfare payments at a constant 3.7% of GDP while pushing up the number consistently to reach the 16 million. We are not a welfare state by any measurement. So if you add to this the substantial public housing stock that's been built over the past 20 years, and well, Slicker may be wrong, although I wouldn't say that in front of him. It's said often that revolutions in the arts, a reawakening, a flourishing, reflects the growth of nations, the progress of countries. So where are we? In film, there's Othello burning, there's Vryheid, Intersections, Man on the Ground, there's a Western being shot in the Karoo, there's global casting to play the role of Mandela. I didn't go to a local person. There's the makers of Ukaman Ukailicha doing La Boheme, I believe. Cape Town, as I'm sure you well know, continually makes the lists of the world's coolest cities, and we all understand why. And then there's this. So it's okay, I also think they're awful, but maybe some of you don't. And that's the Antwoord, last seen, I think, making advertisements in New York and being thrown through adoring crowds. So what the Americans make of your masterpuss in a fist-based look, I'm not quite sure. I have no idea, really. But the Antwoord is part of a long list that I scribble on a lot because I'm doing a book about it, of South Africans who are making it very large on the world stage. So here's our list, yeah? Some of it at least. All know him, that's last night. Cameron, night before, 2 nights before. Nelson Mandela, the Arch, George Bezos, Winnie. Whenever I put her up, people don't always agree, but still I do. Elon Musk, Himla Sudhya, There's Lira, Herman Mashaba. The Working for Water program won many awards. And then, of course, the SK bid, headed by Naledi Pandor and by Bernie Vanneroff. So my list is very long, and it's an effort by City Press to see to alter how we South Africans see and understand ourselves, not through the blinkered lenses that we often don, and also to deal with the people in audiences like this one who always ask me, so why the hell doesn't the media tell the good news? There it is. We're now up among the nations that will matter by virtue of our membership of the BRICS group of countries. And then this woman won a BET award recently. I think she's phenomenal. That's Lira, but I'm sure you all knew that. We also have highways, which put India to shame. I've traveled there and know this. We have growing ports that are getting better for growing exports, even though the economy is down. We have rail links that are shaping the economy in radical new ways. And there's about R1 trillion going to be spent on new infrastructure to build towns around the commodities deposits with which we are so blessed. Some of these include titanium, platinum, steel, gold, and I'm sure that these prices will bounce right back, although we know where they are. Now, the next slide's going to get me into trouble, as it does in academic audiences. ShopRite will, I predict, give Walmart a run for its money if the government ever allows Walmart to start operating. And who knows, maybe we'll even get 4G broadband if we get that particular act together. This economy is not a basket case, neither is our country, and that's not by accident. Our economic managers, Praveen Gordhan, Trevor Manuel, a very young Trevor Manuel, Jill Marcus, and Lesetja Khanyaho are absolutely world-class financial managers, and I think they've done us well. Geography also helps us. So while we've spent a lot of our modern history trying to pretend that we weren't at the tip of Africa, suddenly it's at the south of a continent of growing hope. Africa is a continent home to 7 of the world's fastest growing economies. Broadband is bringing down the cost of doing business, as is democracy across sub-Saharan Africa. On education and health here back at home, I do see some strides. The matric pass rate is ticking up steadily and possibly not improbably, even though the week is filled with calls to get rid of the education minister. And we started testing again at grades 3, 6, and 9. These are good things. That's the one side of the story. But there is a very, very sad side to the story as well. A few months ago, my colleague at City Press, Sipho Masondo, who works in Limpopo, uncovered the textbook shortages at a school where he noticed that the students were, well, singing all day because they didn't have anything else to do. So we thought that either they're training the next Ladysmith Black Mambazo, or we are training hewers of wood and drawers of water. These are images from the Eastern Cape and from Limpopo. Inadvertently, I wondered, have we created a system like Bantu education, as well as Mampela has also written about this very often, which stunts hope and which kills dreams? I suspect that we have, because what we have now are 3 million young people who are unemployed and largely unemployable. The system is disgorging at least 100,000 new graduates a year, a tiny percentage of whom we found will make any lives of meaning in the new democracy. So with the pass rate set at 30%, I think we're seriously kidding our young people when we tell them that this might make them ready for a life of meaningful work or even of entrepreneurship. In fact, this world that we know here, it's pretty inaccessible, unpredictable, and unreachable. That picture was taken this year. It breaks my heart every time we see it. So add to the 3 million young people, the adult unemployed, and yes, Moeletsi and Becky may well be right. By 2024, could there be large-scale rebellion here? Perhaps another revolution. I think that unless we don't get our young people into work, into the system, and offer them lives of hope, that may very well be a reality. I think that the angry youth bulge is perfectly unsustainable, and it's not going to be placated by grants as the older generation has been. Not when you can see through the looking glass at our worlds of privilege that still make ours very much an apartheid landscape. So last week, we were surprised again at a World Bank report which found that if we don't address inequality, the key index, we're not going to achieve inclusive growth or a generalized prosperity in South Africa. The numbers are pretty grotesque. The reality of a Gini, that's the Gini coefficient, the measure of wealth, is with us already. And if you don't believe us, have a look at the following images. Pretty grotesque. There's the beautiful Gautrain, and there's a recently burnt metro rail because it never left on time, so people burnt it. There's Danephone, and there's Diepsloot. They really do reside right next to each other. That's the Maponya Mall in Soweto. Soweto is a proper city. And that's Orange Farm in Soweto at a protest early this year. Clifton and the Flats. So there's already a rebellion about this kind of gross inequality underway. Every day there's a protest or two somewhere. By mid-June, the municipal IQ had already notched up over 700 protests this year. That's well over 2 a day. Our reporters suggest that IQ is not counting Mpumalanga, the Free State, and other deep rural areas, so it may even be higher than that. It's happening already, but the only time that we in the urban centers notice is when the flames flick too close to home. Why? Why are people so angry? Well, for one, it's winter, electricity costs are rising, and water is not putting out fires, but causing them. Blue-outs, that's water cut-offs across Mpumalanga and the Free State, are the new matchsticks. So are jobs, people are desperate for work. So is tender corruption, unbuilt police stations, poor councillors who are more interested in blue lights than sewage pipes themselves, electricity, and toilets. The stuff that I guess most of us in this lecture room take for granted is still not a common asset across our country. Of course, some of this is legacy. Apartheid's spatial geography has made transport costs extremely high. Much of the discouraged workforce, and there are millions of people who have simply given up looking for work, have done so because taxi fares are too expensive for them to afford. Globalization and integration into a global economy has meant that the petrol price yo-yos, as we know. Food prices have shot up, and apartheid-era subsidized electricity is gone, so power has been increasing. Still, I find that the laying of structural blame, of blame on structural economy, on an inchoate enemy, and on capitalism in general, as our government has taken to doing, is simply disingenuous. I often wonder when I hear people speak but where have you been? You cannot now claim that hoary old chestnut of having been in power, of having been in office but not in power. What have you been doing for 18 years? I think President Jacob Zuma did a very fine version of this on Rudi Direko's show last week when he said that, well, Hendrik Verwoerd was to blame for the textbooks that hadn't been delivered to Limpopo schools. Louis Ogola says Limpopo is the place textbooks go to die. So Verwoerd will be responsible for a long time yet for very many things. But as the ANC pointed out at its weekend Lekgotla, the textbook the textbook failure, and I think it's a symbol of something much greater, is a failure of government, our government, at two levels, both provincial and national. And last week's Auditor General's report revealed, that's Terence Nombembe there, revealed just how much of this failure is made by us. If audits are a measure of how well we spend public money, then clearly there's a problem. Consultants are keeping councils up in many, many places because our officials lack even the basic qualifications to run municipalities. We're paying twice, basically, for staff who are supposed to be doing the job. And how do we know all of this about our country? So who here regularly reads or has read Vuk'uzenzele? Nobody, yet it is the newspaper in South Africa with the highest print order. It's the government's account of opportunities in the good news. Last time I checked, there were thousands of undistributed copies at my post office, and at yours too, I'm sure. Yeah? Chances are that you know what you do because you consume media in South Africa. Countries with free medias don't have famines, but they do have crises. In most every audit of South Africa, our free and robust media comes out right on top. So you can imagine my surprise at feeling how I did earlier this year when we had done what we do, which is to report well. I realized then, so this is what it feels like when your freedom starts to go. I felt a clenching around my throat. Nobody had their fingers around it, but for days and days the words just wouldn't come out. And when they did, it was as if to engage in a dialogue with the deaf. So this, I thought, is what it feels like when your freedom starts to go. As Jacques said earlier, whenever the histrionic among us have declared that free expression is on the skids, I've pooh-poohed them. Nonsense. These were the iterations, the words of either the young or the previously privileged or the hysterical who had lived through those days and keep claiming wrongly that apartheid repression is making a comeback. It's a tiresome hysteria because honestly you can't compare then with now, not at all. I still don't think that it's a fair comparison, but independently I feel my freedom being eviscerated. I know what an absence of freedom feels like because I've lived then and I live now. And don't laugh at my hair, please. There. So, take it down, Nelia. So I grew up in Bosmont, an apartheid group area, among people who looked like me, spoke like me, and believed like me. They were the same color as me, the same class, and of the same destiny. It was social engineering, I realized only much later, a form of Nazism, surely. It's only through the hard work of working-class parents that we were able to evade the destiny of the clothing factory, where both my parents started and ended their working lives, or the destiny of leaving school in what is now grade 10 and becoming a school teacher to then reinforce the cycles of colored destiny again and again and again. My young life was one long trek to escape group area's clutches. My brothers had to change identity several times, so my mother had mine inscribed Indian and Cape Malay to ensure that she didn't again have to alter the id of a kid. Only now does it strike me as odd that we had to keep moving, and that the serial retrenchments my father suffered were an outcome of a corrupted destiny. Only now do I understand the benefits of inherited privilege and how much we, our country, had to overcome to be free. My sense of freedom's potential came when I joined organizations fighting the Group Areas Act. By the time I became a journalist, it was only a continuation of this fight, and we worked through times that were decidedly unfree. Information flows were opaque, corruption endemic. Not for a moment do I buy the view that the apartheid state was somehow less corrupt than the democratic state. I think it's rubbish. We simply did not know. Privilege inherited and risk was real. So these guys knew well. Donald Woods, Percy Kaboza, Matata Tsedu, Joe Tlolwe, Raymond Lowe, canned timber. Our risk was that set out above, but theirs was much deeper. Ours was occasionally getting shot at, chased by police dogs, being lied to, and being censored but not killed. So journalism has always been a quest for freedom for me. And I have loved reporting since 1994, writing and later editing in ways I hope have been fair to the new country, to its every gain and its every pain. I still don't think we do the gains enough, which is why I started as I did. For me, corruption has been the deepest, deepest pain. That greed showed its face so very, very quickly, and the clutch of power proved terribly fast and terribly seductive. So at Parliament, I remember a trade union leader turned arms negotiator asking, "So, lady, do you want to ride in a great big plane?" I think you were serious, but I said no. "Not really," I replied, wondering if he realized that we were all going to be taken for a great ride that would mark the first large-scale abuse of public funds and mark us as seduced by the world's wily ways. Now that arms deal corruption feels very small compared with what we deal with almost every week. When it's all counted, I think you'll find that Limpopo has been looted by billions of rands, a price paid in absent textbooks, roads which crumble, and the like. What we discount is the cost on development of corruption, perhaps an extension of Amartya Sen's work. Perhaps it should be a logical follow to his work to then calculate, if development is freedom, what is the cost to that development of corruption? And what I'd now like to focus on is the impact of corruption on freedom, on our freedom, on my freedom. I'm sad that this year my journalism is perhaps best known for the spear. The biggest battles we fought at two papers on freedom of expression have been about uncovering corruption. They've been about the National Police Commissioner, Jackie Selebe, the Youth League President, Julius Malema, the Scorpions, the SABC, and of late, the Lieutenant General, Richard Mdluli. Each of these instances has been about corruption, alleged, then often proven later, where free expression becomes a direct threat to eating. You win some and you lose some. Through each, I think freedom is constrained as costs mount, and the freedom of journalism is constrained by the language of legal fairness. But oftentimes, freedom has won. The courts have struck definitive blows against pre-publication interdicts again and again. But the spear was, for me, a whole different ballgame, and I come out in a different era. That's the spear. I think the artist is in the house somewhere. I have no doubt that the fight about this was an easy comeuppance for a media with which the governing party is often at odds because it dislikes the mirror which we hold up to our society. It was about corruption too. The entire theme of Hail to the Thief, Brett Murray's exhibition, was about the seductions of power, or what the ANC calls the sins of incumbency. There's a fist raised in Amandla and slammed down in repression. I wanted to buy that one, but it got sold very quickly. There's the ANC for sale and the ANC sold. The bastardization of epic struggle posters to prove a point. We have a long history of art that has troubled power, and I'll take you through some of it. I don't remember all the artists. I hope you can see clearly. Nelson Mandela, this image was banned back in the day. You couldn't publish it. Around 1976, a piece of art like this being published could have gotten editors into big trouble. This was one of the few times when Thabo Mbeki was satirized. This was Chief Albert Luthuli as the Black Jesus. Stephen Cohen being evicted from a monument, I forget which one. Zanele Moholi's photographs, which saw the arts minister, the former arts minister, now women's minister, leaving an exhibition that she had sponsored. This was about identity and race. The ashtray shaped like a vagina. That was about Jacob Zuma and many kids, naughty one. The Kanga at the time of the rape trial. This was the autopsy of Mandela. This one is interesting for me in that it deals with circumcision, but it sits in the KZN Art Gallery, and it's seen, often it's used as a teaching tool for young people to tell them about why circumcision is so important in the fight against HIV infection. And then there's this one by Cape Town's own Ayanda Mabulu. I wonder why this image didn't get the artist a near lynching. On the left, your left, yes, is Jacob Zuma. And on the right is the beloved Archbishop. Big statements in there. Why the SACP leader and Higher Education Minister Blade Nzimande didn't object to this one. So when Nzimande stood up at an NUM conference and made the first boycott call against City Press, I felt my freedom being constrained. Later the same day, the ANC's Jackson Mthembu did the same thing. What many don't know is that the ANC and the presidency had realized by then that their case was extremely weak, and they played a large part in getting the urgent interdict they had sought taken off the court roll, and they immediately went to the streets to call for a boycott. We were played grandly. So thank you for those of you who went out to buy more than one copy. We are very grateful. So we laugh now, but then at that moment, I really felt the future. So when next a political scapegoat is needed to hang a political campaign on, the media will be fair game, especially if you're big and if you're black like City Press is. We almost became the focal point of a presidential campaign for re-election. 2 days later, the paper was burnt in a march led by one of the first ladies, paid for by our tax money, and attended by the political and business glitterati. 3 days later, the paper was boycotted. Then, a day later, I took the image down off our website because its publication and its dissemination had opened up a deep and collected woundedness. It had showed me a dignity as fragile as a piece of dove-shaped origami. It was, I said at the time, a decision I had taken as an olive branch extended in citizenship, a lesson I learned from your Pumla Gobodo Madikizela, who has revealed time and time again the power of reaching out across seemingly insurmountable barriers, the power of love over hate, the power of standing down for the greater good. But it was also because, let me be frank, because City Press had been burnt, I had been insulted, and so my freedom died a little, taken by my own hand, but also by the hand of the Film and Publications Board. That body is meant really to protect children from harmful content. In that week, I saw it morph into a political handmaiden. In about 20 hours of hearings, the screeching limitations of cadre deployment were writ loud, from the CEO to the spokesperson, to the classifiers whose names you can't know. Their minds were made up long before the hearing we insisted upon with the gallery. And this was the outcome, a classification of 16 for nudity on a painting, the second time. This was a predetermined outcome which had almost nothing to do with protecting children. It was done to satisfy political masters. I felt my freedom evaporate as I realized, so this is how it happens. You hollow out institutions, you stack them with deployed cadres, you politicize the bureaucracy, you create an enemy, and then you mount a populist cause. Achieving freedom took very many decades, and it took thousands of lives, but it takes very, very little to kill it. I think the Auditor General's report shows us something similar, that you can have the same effect when you harm institutions from the inside. You can impact on development as freedom. And then I saw it in action again at a set of parliamentary hearings into transformation in the print industry, where, abetted by ideologically hidebound academics and by government minstrels, The committee fired the next shot across the bow of free expression. There have been many. If you stack the institution with cadres, if you close the space for independent thinkers, and if you mount a populist cause, you inevitably harm freedom. The upshot of all of this is that I am a changed person. I'm less a child of Mandela's generation than I used to be, and more a freedom of expression fundamentalist. I would not take down that image today, knowing what I do now. That power of love, of standing down, of reconciling to a greater good has withered in my eyes, and it's been made to wither by a failed and a flailing leadership, by men and women who are shadows of the people who led us into the democratic era. This fundamentalism I recognize as not being terribly healthy. No fundamentalism ever is. But through this and other episodes in the years of freedom, I've come to understand that this lifeblood is so easily and so quickly undermined that you have to be extremely vigilant to protect its fragility, which, like our dignity, is also just paper thin. So 18 years after apartheid officially died, where are we? Where are we after a policy that was akin to ethnic cleansing, in the depths of its depravity and in its generational impact? It was evil, and it was determinedly so. A policy to stunt a people, to stunt cognition, to stunt ambition, to stunt esteem, and to embroider inferiority into the soul. That's the court that's meant to undo all that harm. The spear showed me how very successful that policy has been, that a common and shared national dignity is still such an elusive thing, and that a painting, a rendition only, an interpretation, could uncork such deep, deep hurt so very, very quickly. I'm much more deeply saddened that the inheritors of a fine movement can find no clever ways of leading us from where we are, but I'm deeply heartened that civil society is showing the way in fantastic ways. Our civil society is unbending in its principle and its commitment to this land. There's the launch of Mampela Rampele's movement. Note how the Social Justice Coalition entered with the freedom under law for a court application to have the corrupt Lieutenant General Richard Mdluli suspended pending his prosecution on attempted murder and corruption charges. Because of that, we've got ourselves a whole new National Police Commissioner. Notice too how the Right to Know campaign has kept MPs' feet to the fire, in fact kept all our feet to the fire on the Protection of State Information Bill. Notice how Section 27 and Equal Education have forced us to stop making a molehill of a mountain and to call an education crisis a crisis rather than a late delivery. And I think this is why the song explains it.
Get up, stand up. Stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up. Don't give up the fight.
So South Africans are hysterically and notoriously chacharach people. I know. So having been told off by hundreds of people for putting up the spear in the first place, I was then smacked by other hundreds for taking it down again. I think we're a nation in constant and passionate chatter, and that makes us a little Nigerian in the, shall we say, robustness of our discourse. We take our democracy extremely seriously, as we should. It's a precious and hard-won thing, and I have no doubt that we will ensure its protection and its longevity, like this guy said that we should.
Never and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another.
Thank Thank you very much. I'm a free speech fundamentalist, but I have no worries about the state of our freedom 18 years on. I think there are some minutes for questions. Thank you so much.
Sure you all share my sentiment of expressing deep thanks to Ferial for that wonderful talk. We have 15 or 20 minutes or so for questions. I think let's take 4 at a time, and then Ferial can respond to them in a block, and then we'll take more if we have more time thereafter. So if you'd like to identify yourselves if you have a question for Ferial. Yes?
Hi, Ferial. I'm Giovanna Jerry from Eyewitness News. Has the whole debacle with the spear changed you as a person and the way you're going to do things in the future?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I'm concerned that the depths of inequality in our country is likely to mean that many of our citizens are going to lose faith in the Constitution as a means of safeguarding their rights. Do you have views on how we can ensure that the strength of the Constitution is made known to people as a protector of their rights rather than a denial?
Front.
Thank you. You seem to be surprised about developments which occurred recently. Didn't you see this coming a long, long, long time ago?
Here we go. In the front row.
Does one reach, and at what point, if so, a point where there's a moral imperative to oppose a government even if it is democratically elected?
To the Constitution first. There's very exciting work being done by the Socio-Economic Rights Institute at WITS into studying how constitutional courts around the world, notably, they tell me Costa Rica, make it much easier to petition the court directly so it doesn't become that expensive. I think the court does excellent outreach work. And that it's very accessible. What we as the media are not so great at doing is publishing its judgments and popularizing it that way much better. But perhaps in an era of more open, democratic and social media, that can start to happen. I certainly hope so. Was I not surprised? I think I'm a little bit naive that way. Still having grown up in the era of the mass democratic movement, in trusting in the abilities and the goodness of the leadership which ushered in such a period of peace and stability. I think it's a very different ANC today. The one that will go to Mangaung is a way changed beast from the ANC of '94. And it's, I think, deeply concerning for all of us who are Democrats that 3,500 people should be setting our destiny at a party conference, and that surely the larger chorus should be for changed ways of electing leadership. That Frederick van Zyl-Slabbert document, which recommended excellent ideas, has really just been put away, perhaps even filed in file 13. But it requires, and I do see that civil society's awakening will begin to push for a larger reshaping of how we elect people. So I won't be surprised from here, but until this year, yes, I have been surprised. It's changed me fundamentally to answer both of you here. I think now I will be a fundamentalist. I hope with the rest of the SA National Editors Forum, because I think you're going to have to fight hard fights and not always seek consensus and seek to find the other side and to make the requisite compromises. Perhaps we are just in a different era now.
We have time for another round of questions, if there are more. I see James here.
Hi. My question is about the column that you penned straight after taking down the spear. The title was, I believe, Taken Down Out of Intimidation and Fear. And I'd like to ask you to describe for us exactly the kind of intimidation that you felt. I think a lot of us here get very worried when we read something like that, that the nature of intimidation is fundamentally adverse to democracy and adverse to freedom of expression. And I'd like you to describe exactly what went on and perhaps how you felt about it.
On the left of the hall, thank you.
You speak of the impediments of inherited privilege that we need to overcome, the need to create employment, the need to foster development in the country. But one of the strictures that we confront as a society is our inability to reach out across the social divide. We still live in white enclaves. Black people still live in black townships. There has been some degree of movement between the two, but we largely live in those enclaves that were created by apartheid. What is your view of what the longer-term impact will be if we don't find ways of reaching out across that social divide? And indeed, what ought to be done to foster that? It's spoken about repeatedly, but we don't ever seem to get anywhere.
Yes, there in the middle. Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in your fundamentalism. How does one practice a fundamentalist view of freedom of speech or freedom of expression in the face of destruction by a government, semi-totalitarian perhaps? And I have in mind, the choice really made by Alistair Sparks on the Rand Daily Mail to be a fundamentalist to the point where his newspaper was lost completely to the society. And at that point, do you compromise or do you remain a fundamentalist, and how do you make that decision? Thank you.
And then right at the back of the hall, there's a question.
Just leading on from that earlier question about reaching across the social divide, and we live in these enclaves of society, I was wondering if you could comment on the civil society movement that you have much faith in. Are you seeing that to reach across those divides, or is that mainly confined with the haves who are wishing to protect what they do have?
We have to take 5. And there's over here at the front.
Thank you. Do you think that the media is guilty of focusing too much on threats to itself? And I think of the campaign against the Protection of State Information Bill and also other threats, say, in terms of the new powers for state security agencies.
I'll start with Ken Owen's question on being a fundamentalist editor and getting your paper closed down. I think now that faced with what I did, and let me say at the outset, because a lot was written about Koos Bekker having called me or my other CEOs, not one of them did. I was absolutely supported, and in fact my immediate CEO, Esmeré Weideman, was really upset at me for taking it down. I think had it gone on for a bit longer, had the boycott gone on, had the political temperature been ratcheted up, it may have been different. But I think then my option, less than slamming my paper into a wall, would have been to resign, and that would have been the fundamentalist option there, to absolutely refuse to take it down, and that's what I do today. But in fact, I discovered later on, is that there was no black and white about this. There was no easy cutting us into black and white and saying blacks were against and whites were for, not at all. Some of the people most angry with me for taking it down have been young black people who oppose corruption, who oppose a slide in our democracy, and some of the people most angry with Brett for painting it and with me for putting it on the website were older white people who felt that you really are just ruining the Rainbow Nation. Barend Legrandsie, the guy who defaced the painting, a middle-aged white man impelled by his Christian beliefs. So yes, I know that Alistair Sparks' paper was made to close down, and that's where a fundamentalist track can take you. But I do think we are at an era now where you have to draw that line in the sand and put a stake in the ground to protect these rights, especially of the media. Intimidation, there was a lot of it on Twitter, and I see that it's happening around the world and becoming a bit of a topic as we enter into the era of social media. How much of it is allowed? There was some vicious stuff. There were ANC branch members where I lived who were putting out serial mis- and disinformation about the availability or not of the paper. But mostly, as I said in the column, it was out of care and fear. Care because I had read my colleague Justice Malala's column, in which he had written so eloquently about how the painting seemed to have uncorked old anger and old bitterness and harm that we hadn't healed yet, and it was for that reason. I now feel we have a lot to do as a nation to do that, but I wouldn't take that down again, no matter how intimidated or intimidating things got. I felt like we were perched on the edge of danger. There was a lot of political intimidation, and if you know the ANC and trying to cover it, it can become pretty vicious when they're angry with you. And in the Mangaung year, just pragmatically, I couldn't have my team excluded from an inside track. Weak, perhaps, with the benefit of hindsight, but that's what I was thinking at the time. How do we reach across? I honestly think that the next generation, sir, are the only ones who are going to do that. And you see it happening more and more as wealth levels do rise, as the middle class does grow. You see people beginning to mix more naturally. I think our generation really exists in groups, and that generational imperative, I find, is very difficult to break through. It takes a very special human being to do so, and you'd see some people doing that, but for me, if we're going to see it at scale, at mass, it's only going to be the next generation, where you see it beginning to happen already. And I think civil society is crossing those boundaries. I see it in equal education, in the Right to Know campaign, all of which cross both racial and class boundaries in building these very special interest, specific alliances on special issues. And clearly that's becoming the politics of the day right now. Oh, does the media navel gaze? Do we worry about our own freedoms too much? Look, I think we've had a tough time post-Polokwane. There's been the Protection of State Information Bill. There's been the very real threat of a media appeals tribunal. There was then the Press Freedom Commission, where the big debate now is how much of self-regulation do we give away? How do you construct an effective system of regulation without allowing outside influence and therefore, as Raymond Lowe would say, some form of censorship? Honestly, I don't think it's navel-gazing. I see it as a vital part of our democratic edifice, and we have to protect it. Do we do enough on unemployment, on poverty, on hunger? Yes, but then I start my day reading the Daily Sun, and that's all the Daily Sun really does. Thank you.
I want to add my vote of thanks to Ferial Haffajee for the most wonderful lecture, and also for being the person you are, displaying the courage that you have shown through many of these trials, being a role model to many, both in the younger generation and the older generation, in the media, in academia, in civil society structures, and in political organizations. I think having people like yourself occupy those positions, speaking out and standing up for what you believe is enormously important. The ripples that go out from those sorts of actions, we can't imagine how important they are to the world around us, to the society around us. Your talk itself, penetrating and astute and logical, and also delivered with such passion and such multimedia eloquence, was a wonderful thing to behold in a teaching institution. Thank you very much for that. I want to offer you a small token of our appreciation for. And finally, and I come away from the talk hopeful. And I think that's the line that you've treaded so well and carefully and tactfully. It's getting that balance, being able to describe the problems that we face and the challenges. And many of us wake up, I suspect, depressed in particular because of our disappointment and disillusionment with what we hoped where we hoped we would be 18 years after 1994. But your talk strikes a hopeful note, and I think that is what we need to hold on to, and that is what will help mobilize civil society. Finally, I want to just express my thanks to the Academic Freedom Committee for the work they do throughout the year and for organizing the TB Davie Lecture. The previous chair of the committee, Andrew Nash, was in fact the chair when we identified Ferial as the next speaker, so I want to indicate my thanks to him. And other members of the committee, Jacques Rousseau, you've met, David Benneter, Lisa Galgut, Leslie London, the SRC representative, Michael Moss, Donnie Fisser, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, and council members, Craig Howie, and other academics, Jeremy Seekings and Imran Kavadia. Thank you to all of them for helping make this a successful function, and to the Functions and Events Department. Thank you all for coming.
I need to.